The autumn of 1878 had been dry across the Nebraska plains, the kind of dry that cracked the topsoil and turned the wheat fields the color of old paper. Sarah Whitfield sat pressed against the window of the westbound train, her son Thomas curled against her side, his small body burning through the thin wool of his coat. She had boarded 3 days earlier in Ohio with $11, a single trunk, and a letter from her late husband's brother inviting her to his farm near Cheyenne. The letter was 2 years old. She did not know if the invitation still stood or if the brother still lived at the address written on it, but staying in Ohio, in the house that no longer belonged to her, had not been a choice worth considering. Thomas had started coughing somewhere around Omaha. By the second night, the cough had turned wet and rattling, and his forehead had gone hot enough that Sarah could feel it through her palm without needing to touch his skin directly. She did what mothers of her time knew to do. She loosened his collar, gave him water in small sips, and pressed a cool cloth to the back of his neck, since folk wisdom of the era held that cooling the large blood vessels there helped bring a fever down faster than cooling the forehead alone. It was not entirely wrong. The neck, armpits, and groin carry blood close to the skin's surface, which is exactly why later generations of nurses would target those same spots with ice packs during a fever crisis. But a rattling cough and a fever that would not break were also, to a train conductor watching sickness spread through a crowded car, the two clearest signs of consumption, what we now call tuberculosis. And in 1878, there was no test to prove otherwise. There was only fear and the memory of townships gutted by outbreaks nobody could explain or stop. The conductor gave her 1 hour's notice. At the next water stop, a flag station with no name posted on the platform, Sarah and Thomas were put off the train. Her trunk went with them. The other passengers did not look at her as she passed. She did not blame them. She had read the newspapers too. She stood on the platform as the train pulled away, and then there was nothing. No station house, no town, just a stretch of prairie grass moving in the wind, and a dirt road running east to west with no way of knowing which direction led anywhere at all. Thomas was 7 years old. He leaned into her side and asked in the small voice children use when they already sense something is wrong but don't yet have words for it, whether they were home yet. "Not yet," Sarah told him, "but we will be." She chose west, mostly because the sun was beginning to lean that way, and she did not want to walk with it in her eyes for however many hours it took to find something, anything, that looked like help. She carried the trunk 20 yards, set it down, walked back for Thomas, carried him 20 yards past the trunk, and repeated the process. It was slow. It would have been slower still if she hadn't grown up on a farm herself, where carrying feed sacks and hauling water had built a kind of strength that polite society rarely acknowledged in women, but which kept many a homestead running. By the third hour, her palms were blistered from the trunk handle, and Thomas's breathing had grown shallow enough that she stopped every quarter mile just to watch his chest rise and fall. It was the sound of wagon wheels that reached her before the wagon itself came into view. A steady creak, and the low rhythm of a horse walking, not trotting, which told her whoever approached wasn't in any particular hurry. She stepped to the side of the road and waited, because a woman alone on an empty stretch of prairie in 1878 waited to see who approached before deciding what to do next. The wagon belonged to Jacob Reyes, a rancher whose spread lay 6 miles north, and who was returning from the same flag station with a delivery of feed corn he hadn't managed to get on the train in time. He was 34, widowed 2 winters back, and ran 400 head of cattle with the help of 2 hired hands and considerably less sleep than he needed. He slowed the wagon before she had to say a word. "You're a long way from anywhere, ma'am," he said. "We were put off the train," Sarah answered. There didn't seem to be a version of the truth that sounded better than the plain one. "My son's ill." They thought it might be catching. Jacob looked at Thomas for a long moment, not with the flinch she'd grown used to seeing on strangers' faces, but with the flat, assessing look of a man who had spent a decade doctoring sick calves and injured hands with nothing but a home medicine chest, and whatever the nearest town's doctor could spare on a bad month. "Fever's high," he said. It wasn't a question. "Since yesterday." "Cough dry or wet?" "Wet." "Rattling." "In his chest." Jacob nodded slowly, working through it the way a rancher works through a sick animal's symptoms, methodically without panic, because panic never cured anything and often made a bad decision look faster than a good one. Could be consumption, he admitted. Could just as easy be pneumonia, or even a bad case of the grip settled in his chest. Trained conductor wouldn't know the difference. And, truth told, out here, neither would most folks. But I'll tell you what I do know. Leaving a sick child on an empty road doesn't cure anything either way. Get up on the wagon. It's worth pausing here on something Sarah herself likely didn't fully understand in that moment, and something worth understanding now. The fear that got her put off that train was based on a confusion that plagued frontier medicine for decades. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis, and even a severe cold could all produce a similar surface picture: fever, cough, and fatigue. And without a stethoscope-trained ear or a laboratory test, there was genuinely no reliable way to tell them apart in the field. Tuberculosis was in fact contagious, spread through airborne droplets, and the era's fear of it wasn't irrational on its face. But pneumonia and bronchial infections, while they could be serious and even life-threatening, particularly in a child, were not spread the same way, and a great many people who died of untreated pneumonia in the 19th century were, in life, mistaken for consumptives and shunned accordingly. The tragedy of that confusion is exactly what put a 6-7-year-old on an empty road with his mother. It's also, in a strange way, what makes Jacob's response worth noting. He didn't dismiss the risk of contagion outright, and he didn't pretend to know more than he did. He simply weighed the immediate certain harm of leaving a sick child exposed on the prairie against the uncertain possible risk of illness, and made the more reasonable choice. Jacob's ranch house sat a half-mile back from the road, a low timber frame building with a stone chimney and a barn twice its size, built for cattle rather than comfort. He carried Thomas inside himself, laid him on a bed in the room that had belonged to his own son before scarlet fever took the boy 3 winters past, a fact Jacob did not mention that first night, and one Sarah wouldn't learn until much later. He kept a small chest of remedies that most working ranches of the era stocked out of necessity, since a doctor might be a full day's ride away, and an infection didn't wait politely for one to arrive. There was willow-bark, which contains the same compound, salicin, that would later be refined into aspirin, and which frontier households brewed into a bitter tea to bring down fevers and ease pain. There was camphor, rubbed onto the chest for congestion, and there were clean linens boiled and set aside, since the germ theory of disease was still working its way into common practice by the 1870s. But plenty of ranch wives and rural doctors had already noticed, empirically, that boiled cloth healed better than unwashed cloth, even without knowing precisely why. Jacob sent one of his hired hands riding for the nearest doctor, a full 18 miles east, while he and Sarah worked through the night, steeping willow-bark tea, changing cool cloths, keeping Thomas propped upright rather than flat, since an upright position eases the work of breathing when the lungs are congested, a principle still used in hospitals today, now under the more clinical name of positioning for respiratory comfort. The doctor arrived past midnight, examined Thomas with a stethoscope Jacob had never seen up close before, and delivered his verdict. Pneumonia, settled in the lower right lung, serious but not consumption, and not, in his professional opinion, contagious in the way the trained conductor had feared. With rest, fluids, and the continued care Jacob and Sarah had already begun administering, the doctor gave good odds for recovery. Thomas's fever broke on the 4th day. Sarah stayed through his recovery, which took the better part of 3 weeks, and in that time something happened that neither she nor Jacob had planned for, and both were slow to name. He taught her the workings of the ranch almost without meaning to, how to read weather coming across open plains before it arrived, how a cow bawling a certain way meant a calf in trouble, how the position of a wagon wheel rut told you whether a road had washed out recently or simply hadn't been traveled in a while. She, in turn, brought an order to his household that 4 years of widowhood had let slip. Mended clothes, a garden turned over for spring planting, meals cooked with a thrift born of necessity that impressed even a man who prided himself on running a tight operation. Thomas, once well, followed Jacob around the barn with the single-minded devotion boys of that age reserve for the first steady man in their lives. And Jacob, who had buried his own son's toys in a trunk he couldn't bring himself to open, found himself instead teaching a different boy how to coil a rope. Sarah wrote to her brother-in-law near Cheyenne and received a reply within the month explaining gently that he had remarried and moved his family to Oregon Territory 2 years prior. The invitation in the old letter no longer stood and had not for some time. She told Jacob this news over supper, expecting it to unsettle her, and found instead that it settled something else entirely. There was, after all, nowhere else she was meant to be. They married the following spring, in a small ceremony attended by the 2 hired hands, the doctor who'd ridden out that first night, and a scattering of neighbors from ranches Sarah had come to know over the winter. Thomas stood beside Jacob rather than beside his mother, a detail nobody had asked of him, and everybody understood. The road that had put Sarah and Thomas off at an unnamed flag station is still marked on old county surveys, though the rail line itself was rerouted decades ago, and no train runs it now. What remains is a simple lesson the frontier taught more than once, in more than one form. Certainty was a luxury few people on the plains could afford, and the choice that mattered most wasn't always the one made with complete information. It was the one made with the willingness to act despite not having it. A stranger's fever might be consumption or might be nothing of the kind. A road might lead somewhere or might lead nowhere. The only way to find out, in either case, was to keep moving toward the person in front of you rather than away from them. Jacob Reyes never described what he did that afternoon as anything remarkable. He'd simply seen a sick child on an empty road, and the road wasn't going anywhere else that day either.